Why build this? Why move over 20 tons of earth, stone, and concrete into the middle of a hot desert to build something that doesn't even provide shelter, food, or payment? Most of the things that I design and build are functional, but as I've gotten older, I've become a little bit more of a feelings over facts kind of person. I feel excitement and curiosity when I think about new ways of making that I haven't tried yet. And even though I haven't finished building the furniture from my own house yet, I feel like this project is more important than just upgrading my home office. This project was pretty brutal physically, and what kept me motivated was a sense of curiosity. Can I take techniques that I've always been fascinated with, like the woodworker's lathe and the potter's wheel, and then scale those ideas of rotational form up to the size of landscape, but designed for human inhabitation? For me, creativity is just giving your curiosity a really healthy dose of steroids and caffeine. It's turning from a passive "I wonder if" to "I must do that," even if I have to bleed and sweat all over the desert. High winds, 100-degree temperatures are great reasons not to do something outside, which is why I really cling on to the positive reasons, even if they're really vague, just to keep that energy to push through. And even though I'm quite nice with the angle grinder, I still feel my greatest skill is ignoring all the reasons why I shouldn't do something and focusing just on the few that sound really fun that give me a reason to do it. Plus, I have a wide variety of mediocre skills like welding, concrete forming, and cutting plywood with a jigsaw. And I'm a firm believer that if you combine the right amount of mediocrity, you can actually create something special. If I could describe my welding in one word, it would be mid. I can get the metal to stick together and hold pretty well, but my beads are real sloppy and I can require quite a bit of grinding if I want them to be finished pieces. Thankfully though, I have these magnetic clamps that hold things at a right angle, and luckily, all I'm doing here is making the tool for the project and not the project itself. Basically, I'm reinventing the wheel, and it's a combination of the potter's wheel and the wheel of pain from Conan the Barbarian. I started this project with a lot of doubts. I had an idea of how I would make it, but I wasn't sure if it would actually work. And what I was sure of is that if this thing failed, it would result in literally tons of rock, concrete, and dirt stuck together that I would have to figure out how to break up and remove. And this is scary because I'm just one of the owners at the Reset Hotel, and a lot of other people have invested time and money into this project. And so there's a lot more pressure than when I'm just doing furniture projects at my own house. Because if this goes wrong or the finished product doesn't look like what they imagine, there's no one to blame other than me. And it's not like this was something that came with an instruction manual or has a clear precedent. Risk and creativity, though, go hand in hand. And knowing this resulted in me spending a lot of time investing to create this one rotating tool. This tool is so critical to the project, and I put time into it almost as a form of productive procrastination. It made me feel safer when I worked more on it. I was so hesitant to get started on the land, and I just wanted to tinker around making a device before everything got real serious. I think that this tool is the idea for the moon pad, and it's to use a rotational arm with a template to form earth, stone, concrete into shapes that are designed for human inhabitation. For this project, the idea isn't about the way it looks. It's about how we create a process that will make something that looks different. The ideas I get the most excited about aren't about a finished look for a thing. They're about a specific technique that I feel I can do that might result in something that I haven't seen before. So the renderings came way after I had the idea for the rotational arm and template. So even though the renderings look like UFOs dropped in the middle of the desert, the inspirational concept came from watching woodworkers on a lathe or ceramicists at the potter's wheel. So this rotational template is the idea, and the 20-foot circular lounge chair for looking at the moon is the design. I drew the lounge shape in Illustrator so that I could print a full-scale paper template to glue onto the plywood before cutting it with a jigsaw. I knew I was going to be pushing quite a bit of weight in the form of wet concrete, so I glued 2 layers of 3/4 inch plywood together to give this template some strength. I also clear coated it with polyurethane. For the swiveling mechanism, I found 3.5-inch steel pipes that fit perfectly over each other. The walls are almost a 1/4 inch thick, so I felt like I could rely on them to create a nice sturdy swinging arm. Challenges and friction to implementing my ideas started immediately as I tried rotating the arm. You see the pole's straight, but the ground isn't level, and we have a multitude of little rocky speed bumps. So we had to push, scrape, and dig our way to get a relatively even track for this kind of undersized wheel. With all the friction force and uneven ground, I realized I needed a collar that would keep the arm from sliding too far down the pipe. I also realized that with 10 feet of steel leverage, my pushing on the arm was rocking and moving the concrete foundation around the axle. So we had to pour another 300 pounds of concrete over the top. My plan was to build up the mound using sandbags, rock, and dirt to minimize the amount of concrete that we would need. Ideally, we'd only have to pour about 4 inches of concrete to create a hard shell. But I'm going to need a pretty firm surface under that concrete because I wouldn't want erosion or settling to create cavities or gaps that could cause the whole thing to crack and fail. I like the idea of using fortified sand and sandbags to create rings that I can tamp down. Then I'll fill in between those rings with rock and dirt so that when I'm tamping that rock and dirt down, there's some borders to keep everything contained. For these critical structural rings, Jessie and I mix Portland cement in with some leftover sand to make bags that would solidify and not compress too much. Filling bags, hauling them over, tamping them down was a lot of work to create 2 circles that didn't even fill up 10% of the total volume that we would need. And so I decided to start another project, to help me with this project. This is the kind of creative procrastination that I suffer from greatly. But we were so tired of hauling sandbags about 400 yards out to the moon pad that I decided to make a big pile of dirt. Don't just want to dig a hole for no reason, so this is actually the origin story of the conversation pit. I basically came up with a reason to dig a big hole and turn it into something useful so I could get a bunch of dirt close to the moon pad site. For the conversation pit, we used local rock and sand and just bound it together with Portland cement. And you can see a full video of how we built this project right here on the Homemade Modern channel. I would fill up wheelbarrows full of dirt, and then Jessie and Shane would wheel them about 80 to 100 feet over and dump them in between the rings of the sandbags. Have you ever tried to push a wheelbarrow full of dirt up a slight incline on rocky terrain? It's really hard. If you watch Shane and Jessie, you can see them take the occasional pause because they're getting worn out pretty fast. I'm always humbled and grateful when I see how hard the team works to help bring my ideas to life. But everyone has their limits, and it's really important not to push people so hard that it becomes discouraging and a drag. And this also adds pressure to the project, because if it doesn't turn out well, people are going to remember how hard they worked for a failed idea. As the team leader, it's important that I prioritize the things that only I can do, but I also think it's important to demonstrate that I'm willing to do all of the tasks involved. Again, since I'm concerned about compaction and things sliding around underneath the concrete, I mixed in a little bit of Portland cement with the dirt and then watered it down and then used a tamper to press everything nice and firm. Sandbags are pretty inexpensive, and we had this nice pile of dirt, so we kept filling those up because you never know when you're going to get a desert rainstorm, and we wouldn't want to see all that nicely shaped dirt get washed away. There's an abandoned road nearby, and on the sides of it was a whole bunch of broken up asphalt. So we beautified the desert a little bit and stole as many chunks of these as we could get. It's actually not stealing because it's on our land, but it did feel like we were getting something for free. Getting water on site is also a challenge. We would need over 1,000 feet of garden hose to get to the nearest spigot, so we had to keep refilling the water tank in the back of my truck and hauling it over about 150 gallons at a time. This was a lot of hard work, and the temperatures ranged from 88 degrees to 102 degrees. And this is the point where you're really questioning your life decisions, because I'm not even sure exactly how this thing's going to come out. I don't know how well a massive concrete lounge chair in the middle of the desert will go over. And we've only made up about 40% of the total volume. Also, Jessie and I are totally exhausted. But at this point, we can find comfort in the repetition of tasks. We just repeated the cycle of filling sandbags, moving dirt, spreading the dirt around, culminated with hauling water over to water it down and compact it. Hauling the asphalt over and throwing it from the back of the truck was like a fun vacation from all the dirt work. I mean, it's still hard stuff, but I don't know, just collecting rocks and getting to throw them and hearing satisfying thuds doesn't feel like as much of work. We were making enough progress where we had the opportunity to start thinking about future problems that were gonna come up. The template arm wasn't swinging that smoothly, so we cut a bunch of plywood tracks so that it'd have a nice stable surface to roll across. This did mean we had to dig deeper for that perimeter circular trench. We also saw that we would need a border that would keep rocks and dirt from sliding down off the mound and blocking the tracks. So we need to establish a clean and strong perimeter, sort of like a footing for a concrete slab, and also for containment to keep the tracks clean. We used flexible plastic landscaping borders to establish the perimeter, filled in as much as we could with rocks and chunks of asphalt to minimize the amount of concrete, and then drove in rebar. Then we mixed and poured concrete to create this perimeter foundation. This perimeter foundation will serve as an anchoring point for a bunch of rebar, and then we're going to need to stick some rebar and secure that on top of the mound as well. We made a little volcano shape at the top of the mound and then stuck in some rebar, stabilized with rock, and then mixed and poured concrete again. Now I can bend the rebar over and make sure that it fits underneath the rotating template. I connected the rebar from the top and the bottom with straight pieces in between, and now that I have these pieces that go from top to bottom, I have good places to wire in long circular runs to create a structural grid in the concrete. Easier said than done though, because there's a lot of perimeter concrete to pour, and even though this improvised grade beam is only about 8 inches thick, it was pretty rough. Sometimes I like to force myself into a state of urgency, so I scheduled the concrete truck to arrive well before we were finished building up the mound. I do this because it pressures me into making decisions and getting things done, and one of those decisions turned out to be one of the most important ones for the project. And that was, of course, to throw a rock throwing party. You heard it right, a rock throwing party. So I set up an event on Partiful, made a video invitation of Jessie throwing rocks, and I was super pleased to see my desert friends come together, and all the spots got filled rather quickly. Me and my brother used to throw rocks in the creek when we were kids, and that was pretty fun, so why not make an adult party out of it with food and beverages? And one of the things I love about the Joshua Tree area is that there's a lot of people out here that think the same way. When everyone arrived, we spent about the first 15 minutes collecting rocks that surrounded the moon pad and putting them into little personal piles. It wasn't the fastest working environment because a lot of us had a drink in a hand, but we got the piles set up, did a little countdown, and started throwing the rocks. To avoid friendly fire, we set up in almost a half circle. That way no one was directly across from each other. My friend Ray, who's an excellent baker, brought a bunch of treats that were baked to look like rocks. We had ribs and some of the best wine from the Reset Hotel. There was a lot of skeptical questions about how I was going to finish this and turn this into anything other than an ugly pile of asphalt and rock. But luckily for me, that didn't affect the enthusiasm.
Ready? 3, 2, 1, throw.
This was really fun for me. I had a drink in one hand, and they say many hands make light work. Well, that's true. And in just a few hours until it got dark, we moved about 4 tons of rock from the surrounding landscape onto the moon pad. This was a great reminder that the process can be its own reward. Doing this with a bunch of friends was gratifying and fun, and I went to bed knowing that I would need 4 tons less of material to finish this thing out. I woke up refreshed next morning and got started preparing for the big concrete pour. Now, this swiveling wheel was giving us a lot of issues, so I took that one off and replaced it for a fixed wheel. This makes it a lot easier to swing the arm back and forth without the wheel having to turn around. That's going to be important when we try to screed and level the concrete, because if we have a lot of buildup against the plywood, a rapid back and forth movement will be necessary to get things to settle. I ordered 6 yards of 4,000 psi concrete with a 5-inch slump. This cost me about $1,100, and I ordered it from high-grade materials. They were actually pretty easy to work with, even though they mostly work with big construction operations. They were surprisingly DIY and consumer friendly. We started by dumping the concrete on top of the mound, and then using rakes and hose to spread it out. You see, I'm not strong enough to push a giant pile of concrete and use the arm for all the spreading. The most I could could push was about 4 to 6 inches of built up concrete along the entire surface of the template. The concrete is also constantly settling, so even when you think you get it right in one area, you sometimes have to go back, add a few shovelfuls, and then re-screed it with the rotating arm. I'm really glad we thought to put some chicken wire along the perimeter near the base of the moon pad, because that really kept the concrete from sliding off the pad and onto the tracks. And if that would have happened, it would have been a disaster. This was our first time doing anything like this, so we were being pretty cautious on how fast we were dumping the concrete. Once the concrete leaves the chute, it's our problem to deal with, so we didn't want too many problems too fast. We also played it on the safe side, bringing in 2 additional laborers to help in case we got into a pinch. At one point it felt a lot like curling, with Jessie going ahead of me, sweeping the track and keeping it nice and clean, and me making slow, consistent passes with the rotating arm. My goal for the day was to get the middle curves set nicely. If the flat part at the top of the mount isn't perfect, or if the base is just a little bit too steep, I can live with either one of those and patch those in later. The steepest part vertically is at the base of the form where it meets the track, so we had to be really conservative in this area and not pile up too much concrete so that it would slump, spill over, and then clog up the track. The concrete was starting to harden, and that meant the clock was ticking. We were doing pretty good on the overall distribution, and it started to get to the point where I could make complete circular passes all the way around, with most of the middle seat area being completely filled in. The truck only had about 10% of the concrete left in it, so we locked in on filling in the low spots. I would do a few passes, watch for settling, and then patch in the low parts. We needed to get the concrete driver out of here. He had already stayed past his contracted amount of time. Shout out to Robert, great guy. We get different reactions when we bring professional tradespeople into our crazy projects, but Robert seemed genuinely interested and curious, and he was just so pleasant and helpful. So we filled up a bunch of trays with the leftover concrete. I did a few last finish passes, and then we removed the plywood template and used the leftover concrete in the trays to start working on the contours at the base. This was still a lot steeper than what we want in the end, but we had the concrete there and we had a little bit of room between the moon pad and the track, so we put that leftover concrete to work. This was a very successful day. We got the majority of the form shaped, although the surface isn't anything close to where we want to end up. We were able to use all 6 yards of concrete without having to dump any excess. And right away I could tell that I was still going to have to do a lot more hand mixing because the base is way too steep. So that means I'm going to have to remove the track, reuse some of that landscape border, and put in a bunch of rebars so that I can get that gradual contour to the surrounding landscape. I needed to move the location of the wheel for this final set of passes, and I also cut a new template piece. The old one had gotten pretty beaten up, and this one has to extend a little bit farther. I was already really sick of hand mixing concrete, and I was tempted to call in a truck with just a couple of yards, but I don't have enough laborers that I would trust with the troweling to maintain that perimeter form, so it was back to a slow, brutal grind. My plan was to really focus on shape, but only pour about 2 to 3 feet of the perimeter at a time. The rebar helps control the slump, and I use rocks as little dams to kind of control it from sliding off too much to the sides. I really locked in and focused on these short strips where I'm really trying to get that slope the way I want it. Once I have about 12 of these strips set up so it's almost looking like a gear, then I can go in and fill in a little bit faster because I have the teeth on the gear as reference points. I was getting worried though that this part would look segmented since it wasn't benefiting from long sweeping rotations of the arm template. I was concerned it would kind of look like the difference between ceramics thrown on the potter's wheel and those that are hand built. The infill segments went a little bit faster, but we're still hand mixing, and in total we mixed about 250-pound bags of concrete by hand in a tray in the heat. But the end was in sight and our motivation stayed strong. I thought about burying the arm nearby just in case future archaeologists wondered how we made this. We'd give them a little clue. But then I thought, nah, mystery's good, and hopefully this creates conspiracy theories in the future. Removing the arm was really satisfying. I had to chisel out some of the concrete to get that collar out, and I cut the steel axle below the finished surface of the concrete. Now I just have to mix one last batch of concrete and fill in both the steel pipe and the little hole around it. My Viking arm is really handy for removing stakes out of hard ground, and now I was able to peel away all of that landscaping border. In building the hotel, we found a really good stucco crew that does a nice smooth Santa Barbara style plaster finish, but they need water and power in order to do their thing. So we set up a water tower by using some scaffolding, got out the Ryobi battery bank and solar panels for power, and now I can back up my truck with the other water tank in it and use a transfer pump to fill up the tower. Transfer pump? Also Ryobi. I started getting nervous the night before the stucco guys came, and even though they said I didn't need to, I got out the angle grinder and spent a couple hours just smoothing out and contouring the surface. I had underestimated their ability to smooth things out using what's called a scratch coat. This is about a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch thick layer, and it creates a good surface for the final smooth plaster to bond to, and it's like makeup. It covers up a lot of the blemishes underneath. For the final smooth plaster finish, we used a dark beige, or maybe it's just a gray with some warmth. It's the same color that Emmy and Jen of Gray Space specified for the walls at the pool, and it blends really well with this natural landscape. And speaking of blending, Jessie and I's work is not done yet. We had to go collect a whole bunch of rocks from the surrounding landscape. We put those into a bunch of buckets, and then we'd kind of sprinkle them around the moon pad. A lot of trucks and ATVs had been driving through here during the construction, so we really want to get rid of all those tire track marks. So we'd collect rocks, spread them, rake them around until we got things looking nice and pristine. So why build this? Why do all this work? I've been thinking how we live in the most overstimulated, over-entertained, over-caloried, and over-consuming time ever. We have too much of what isn't great, and it feels like we don't always have enough time for what is special. When I was a kid, you were doing well if you had a TV in every room, and nowadays everyone has a screen in their pocket, and a lot of people I meet are trying to reduce their screen time. I like the idea of third places. They aren't a home or a workplace, but rather a place for people to gather. I think of the moonpad as an inhabitable sculpture where people can marvel at the dark skies on warm desert nights. A hotel next to a national park brings people that want to do less. It's not a nightclub, but a base station to experience the best of nature. Museums have benches where you can rest and contemplate the art, and I see this as a lounge for contemplating the sky. So is this art? Well, it was motivated by a cultural observation and crafted to express an idea in sculptural form, but it also has commercial purposes. The Instagram teaser video did a few million views, which built awareness for the hotel itself, and physically it creates a moment for guests to share a visual experience while they stay at the hotel. A lot of hotels use art as part of their marketing plans, and I think it's legitimate to question whether that fact undermines artistic expression. But then I remember that the art of the Renaissance was used to express the power of the Medici family or establish authority of different religious institutions. And when I see old portraits that were commissioned, I tend to think of them as selfies for rich people with maybe a little historic significance and excellent craftsmanship. Building the hotel was a massive challenge. The moonpad is like a concentrated expression of what I wanted to create as a place. I wanted to express that nature is worth traveling to and struggling for. To celebrate, we threw a full moon party. The full moons out here in the desert are spectacular. We brought in a piano. A bunch of the guests took turns playing. My two sisters, who are both exceptional at the piano, gave a little mini recital. And our good friend Ray baked cakes in the shape of celestial objects. And I love the idea of dessert. I think it's a celebration that we don't always have to be pragmatic and functionally oriented. Putting time into it is a declaration of abundance and freedom. It means we acknowledge that we have a lot and that there's still some things out there that are worth trying for their own sake. I like building out a need, and most of my time is spent building houses or the things that go inside of them. But those projects mean more to me when there's something special beyond them. And I like knowing that in my future, there are a lot of projects where the why is questionable. And it's up to you if you want to embark on such adventures, but if you do, I recommend doing it with friends and family.